Hey, if you're new with us or just tuning in for the first time, we started a new sermon series last week called TBH. To be honest, I've had to work on it all week to remember what that stands for, but it means to be honest, in case you didn't catch that right there. It's a series where we're looking at different events, different times where Jesus spoke into the lives of people, and the truth that he gave them transformed their lives. All of us, if you consider yourself a follower of Jesus, have had a moment like this where he was speaking, where he was calling to you, drawing you to himself, and your life was changed. That's when you became a follower of Jesus. So whether you realize it or not, if you consider yourself a follower of Jesus, you've had one of these, to be honest with you, moments. A lot of us have had other moments throughout our lives where we've felt like we encountered God. Some of them seem to have stuck and some of them didn't. I don't know, for those of you who grew up in church, if you went to youth group, maybe you had one of those moments where you went off on a youth retreat and there's this powerful moment where you felt like God met you and then you return home and act exactly the same. Seems like sometimes we have an encounter with God and it doesn't actually change us. But this series is all about those moments where people have that decision of whether they're going to step into it or not. Last week, Pastor Tim talked to us about Matthew and his life-changing moment when Jesus told him to follow him. And that's what he's done with each of us. Today, we're going to be in the book of John. If you want to look at it in on your device or in your Bible, if you've got one, I'm going to go ahead and read John chapter 5, verses 1 through 7. Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. Now there is in Jerusalem near the sheep gate a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Here a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool. When the water is stirred, while I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me." It's almost like Jesus walked up to him and said, "To be honest, do you know that you could be healed?" And his response is, "Sir, to be honest with you, there's no way that can actually happen." Now, there's a lot going on in just these few verses. The first thing that I noticed is that there's a festival going on, and Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. Anytime that the Bible mentions a festival, it means that there's lots of people around. There were 3 times a year where the Jews were required by Jewish law to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, to worship God at this temple, to celebrate the different things that God has done. And so we often see Jesus going to the temple, going to celebrate. On this particular time, he is on his way, and he passes the pool of Bethesda. Now, there were a number of pools in Jerusalem. This particular one is the closest to the temple. And it would have been set down in the rock, and so you would walk up past it, and there were stairs leading down to the pool. And so the text told us that there were a great number of people with illnesses and diseases and various things going on. So there's kind of this crowd just slightly off the path. And Jesus goes down to them. Now, this pool was probably used for all sorts of things. Maybe a little bit of recreation, but it's right near what's called the sheep gate. And the sheep gate, interestingly enough, maybe this will surprise you, is where people brought in sheep to have them sacrificed at the temple. The sheep gate is the closest gate to the temple, and so shepherds and businessmen would sell their sheep outside the sheep gate. And you would buy your sheep and bring it into the temple to be sacrificed. The pool is probably also used for ritual cleansing. There were so many laws, if if you've got some extra time today, you could read through the book of Leviticus. There's all sorts of rules in there that the Jewish people had to follow. Many of them, if they didn't follow it properly, you were declared unclean. Quite often, the last act that you would do to become clean would be a ritual washing. And with this being the closest pool to the temple, this is probably often, as the priest said, okay, now what you need to do is go and wash. This is probably where people would go. So this is a sacred area. This is an important place. And if you noticed in the text, the man said, when the water is stirred, there's no one to take me into the pool. By the time I get down there, somebody else has already beaten me in there. Now, the text itself doesn't give us a whole lot of information about that, which is why at some point, people made a notation within the manuscripts. Some of you may have noticed, if you were reading along, that there's no verse 4 in what I read to you. Now, sometimes you guys know that I skip over verses because there's a whole bunch of names in it, and I don't want to embarrass myself. In this particular case, in the manuscript that the version of the Bible, the NIV, was translated from, that verse doesn't exist. In the oldest manuscripts, verse 4 isn't in there. It's like somebody made a notation at some point, and the later texts have verse 4 in there because they wanted to explain to you verse 7. So I want to go ahead. The words in italics here are the ones that were added in at a later date. Here, a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, the paralyzed, and they waited for the moving of the waters. From time to time, an angel of the Lord would come down and stir up the waters. The first one into the pool after such a disturbance would be cured of whatever disease he had. And so the people copying the manuscripts thought at some point, nobody knows why this guy's saying that he doesn't have any help into the waters. And so this was added in to give us some information. And there's lots of reasons why people might have thought that this was going on. One, people could have gotten into the pool and they were healed. There's not a lot of writings to support that. I had a really hard time. I was trying to find any documentation that said that this was happening on a regular basis, that the waters were being stirred and people were being healed, but it really doesn't exist as far as I was able to discover. There's some Jewish writings, the Mishnah and the Midrash. These were written down probably after Jesus has been around, and they document the oral history of the Jewish people. The Midrash is documented conversations between rabbis and their students. The Mishnah is the oral law. Pastor Tim last week referenced how all these extra laws had been added into the law of Moses, and they're written down in the Mishnah. Neither the Mishnah nor the Midrash mention the pool of Bethesda at all. So we don't know if rabbis are regularly sending people here to be healed, to be cleansed. It's a possibility, though. What we do have in 333 AD, we have the itinerary of a pilgrim from France to the Holy Land. We don't know their name, we just know that they came from Bordeaux, and somehow this document was preserved. But what this document says is they're describing the pool of Bethesda, and scholars believe that this really could be the only pool that this person was talking about, is that from time to time when it would rain, that the waters would turn wine red, and people would go into the pool and they would come out better than they had gone in. They were talking about some minor ailments and people being healed. And so that was the only documentation that I could find that people were being healed here. And it's very interesting. As the water has been studied, basically, this is a mineral bath that people are going into. And they're being healed as they come out. Your body needs some micronutrients to give it the strength to heal things. We also know, and Pastor Tim talked about this last week as well, that cleanliness and washing helps your body heal, especially if you have an infection on your skin or something like that. These are a lot of the things that people are going here to be ritually cleansed from. And so it makes sense that there would be people that saw the pool as an opportunity to be healed. There's only one thing I see in here that really disturbs me. Jesus asks the man if he wants to be healed. And his response is a whole long list of reasons why he can't be healed. I don't know if God's ever asked you a question and you gave him a whole bunch of excuses, a whole bunch of reasons why it can't happen, whether it's traditions or systems, obstacles in your way. This man can see the waters that are supposed to be able to heal him. They're right there in front of him. He's seeing other people perhaps being healed, and he is never the first one into the water. I want to tell you that God never makes us compete for his blessing. He never makes us compete for his healing. He never makes us compete for his grace. This man believes in a God that will only heal him and only bless him if he's the first one in, if he beats out everybody else. That's not the way God's blessing works. He blesses his children because he loves them, not because they beat each other out. It's a very twisted, human-like view to see God as. And I'm not saying that no one was healed there. In fact, I think it's probably likely that people were healed there. But we don't know. We just have this conversation recorded. And so he goes through the list of reasons why he can't be healed. "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I'm trying to get in, somebody else goes down ahead of me. I just can't catch God's grace. I'm too slow." I feel that way sometimes. I'm not capable enough. I'm not smart enough. I haven't studied enough. I don't have advanced degrees enough. How can I ever catch God's blessing? How can he ever use me when I have all this lack and all these things that I just am missing? How can I get God's grace? And yet Jesus' response to him is, "Get up, pick up your mat, and walk." At once the man was healed. To be honest with you, you can be healed. You can be delivered. You can be set free. You can have reconciliation through Jesus. It's not your means. It's not what you have around you, the resources. It's not that. It's through God's grace, through Jesus Christ. There's a lot of us that grew up thinking that Christianity was a set of rules that we had to follow. And if you did everything the right way, if you just got in the water at the right time, then you'd be healed, you'd be set free. That's actually not what following Jesus is about at all. It's about trusting that he can do something when it seems like there's no way. The wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life, and it's free. You can be healed. So the man picks up his mat and he walks. He's already healed when this happens. Jesus speaks to him and the man is healed. Can you imagine if he's like, "I'm not sure, Jesus. I'm going to sit here. These legs haven't moved for 38 years. But up he goes. And where does he go? He goes to the temple, because that's where you go when you've been made whole, when you've been healed, when you've been cleansed. You go to the temple and one of the priests will declare you clean. And so he goes to the temple. And the priests look at him and go, why are you carrying your mat? He says, well, this guy just healed me, and he told me to pick up my mat and walk. So that's what I did. And the priests are so concerned that he's carrying his mat. Their frustration is not that somebody that was once sick is healed. It's that he's carrying his mat. There's no law that says you can't carry your mat. This took place on the Sabbath. There's a law that says you can't do any work. That's what God told the people. Don't do any work. And so to clarify what work was, over the years, more and more things were added to the law to prevent you from working, to prevent you from breaking God's law. And they just kind of summarize things like, so you can't carry anything. And they see this man carrying his mat, and they are so concerned that he's breaking the Sabbath. So when he tells them, a man healed me and told me to pick up my mat and walk, their question is not who healed you, it's who told you to pick up your mat and walk. It's not that dissimilar from the man himself when he was sitting at the pool and saying, here's the reasons why I can't be healed. Their tradition was more important than an act of God in their lives. And so they missed the moment. This could have been a turning point for them as well, but they are more concerned with somebody carrying their mat than being healed. Have you ever missed God doing something because you were more concerned about your tradition? That doesn't happen in our church. That's not the way God moves anymore. There's all sorts of things that I have heard followers of Jesus say, missing the moment of what God has done right in front of them. The man doesn't know who healed him. He doesn't know that it's Jesus. And so this moment that could have been a turning point for him is now almost seems like it's going to be lost because he doesn't even know who healed him. He can't tell the priest who healed him. But I love verse 14. Later, Jesus found him at the temple and said to him, see, you are well. Stop sinning or something worse may happen to you. Now, the ending feels a little harsh, but I'll get to that in a second. The man didn't know where Jesus was. He didn't know who Jesus was, but Jesus still pursued him. Jesus wasn't done with this guy yet. The miracle of healing wasn't all that Jesus had in mind for this man. Jesus continued to pursue him. And we don't know what this man's sin was. We don't know what he could have been doing wrong for 38 years as he can't even move himself. It's hard for me to imagine. Maybe it was bitterness. Maybe he had built up bitterness with all the people that he saw walking in front of him and he couldn't do it. Maybe he was frustrated and bitter at his friends who wouldn't help him into the pool. Maybe he was just fed up with the system and therefore speaking curses over the system. We have no idea what this man's sin was, but Jesus knew that if this was truly going to be a turning point in this man's life, that he had to continue to speak the truth to him. And so he says to him, to be honest, your body might be healed, but there's something deep within you that still needs healing. Stop sinning and allow that space to heal. I wonder how many moments in my own life where I have encountered God and I missed what he was trying to do. See, I think one of the things that this story reveals to us is we know that this man was seeking healing. He thought it was out of reach. He didn't think he was going to be able to get it, but he was seeking healing. We know that much. We don't know if he was seeking God or not. He was seeking healing instead of the healer, perhaps. Perhaps this is a moment where Jesus is inviting him to fully live for God, not just for what God can do for us. I think that's how I learned to follow Jesus. What does Jesus have that I need? How can I get more of what Jesus has? I don't know if I was ever taught to seek God for God, to understand that God is enough. See, that's what following Jesus is actually about. It's about seeking God for God. It's about following Jesus because he is worth it, because he's enough. I think we all come to Jesus out of our need, the things that only he can do for us. But what keeps us in closer proximity to Jesus, what keeps us following him, is not what he can do for us, but it's him. It's just him. Is Jesus enough? A few years ago, I got to go to Dawsonville, Georgia. Has anybody ever heard of Dawsonville? Didn't think so. Dawsonville is a town of about 3,000 people. It's an hour and a half outside of Atlanta. It's not known for anything. It's not talked about. But I went because I heard that something was going on. Can you just flip back to the regular in-between screen? Thanks. I heard something was going on. There was talk of revival. I heard somebody on the radio say that they were going up to the North Georgia revival. And so I was curious, but didn't really care that much. So I ignored it for a few years, and then I heard one of my friends was going, and so I tagged along with them. And we went up to see what this revival was all about. And the guy who was speaking that night, his theology is a little different than mine, but I figured I'm going to stick this out because I know he's talking about Jesus, and even if we interpret some of the scripture a little bit differently, I owe it to this guy to hear what's going on. And so I listened, and then there was a time for prayer, and I went up. I had just taken leadership of the house church network that we had been a part of, and I knew that I needed a little bit more wisdom if I was going to lead this thing well. And so I went up for prayer, and this guy's praying for me, and I kind of glance over my shoulder, and there's somebody, they're getting ready to catch me just in case I fall, and I didn't. And I met with God there. I had one of those encounters, one of those moments where it felt like God was speaking to me and he was leading me. But as some of us were going up for prayer, there was a whole line of people that were forming to be baptized. Most of them not new believers. Most of them had been baptized before. But what so many of us had heard about this was that people were being healed in the water. And that's kind of what I went to see, to observe, to check this thing out. It wasn't until this week that I did a little more research and was curious as to how this whole thing had played out. And I was listening to the pastor talk at whose church that the North Georgia Revival is hosted at. And he said back in 2017, he was burnt out. His church was starting to decline. He had nothing left. He was ready to quit. And he was reading in the Psalms, and he came across Psalm 27, and he got to verse 8. And verse 8 says, "My heart says of you, seek his face. Your face, Lord, I will seek." Psalm 27 is a psalm where David is coming to God, and he's saying, there's all this stuff going on in my life. I can't handle it. It's too much. But the one thing that I seek is to dwell in your house. And I'm going to seek your face. His heart was crying out, knowing that he was beyond what he was capable of. He had nothing left, and he was going to seek God's face because that's all that there was left to seek after trying everything else, after reaching the point where he knew there was nothing he was going to be able to do. He was choosing to seek the Lord's face. Not his deliverance, not his protection, not even his help, just his face. That was the only thing that was going to give David relief. And so this pastor in this small little town said to his congregation, will you join me as I fast and pray for 21 days? We're not going to ask God for anything. We're just going to seek God's face and let him reveal himself as he wants to. The 21 days came to an end, and they had a spontaneous baptism. And then another one. And they kept holding meetings week after week. In addition to Sunday morning, they were now doing Sunday night, and people were coming and being baptized, and they were getting healed. And word began to spread that in the waters, people were being healed. And as I was thinking about this in relationship to the text that we're looking at this morning, I got curious. What's healing the people? How are they talking about this? Because that's going to matter. If we're talking about kingdom stuff and God doing things, is it the water that's healing people? Or is it God himself? You can put that other slide back up. This is on their website. Come meet with him in the water. Come meet with him. The pastor says the water is nothing special. It's just water. Just like our altar up here, there's nothing special about the altar when we invite you to come forward. But they believe that God is meeting people, that God is healing people in the waters. Their tagline is seeking the face of God and raising up a well-equipped community. Seeking the face of God. Look, I'm not telling you not to go to the doctor. In fact, if you're sick and not doing well, will you please go to the doctor? But will you also remember who the great physician is and invite him to come with you and spend some time before you go with the great physician? Worship team, you can come forward. I'm not opposed to counseling. I think counseling's great. But will you remember who the wonderful counselor is? That the Holy Spirit, if you are a follower of Jesus, dwells within you? Would you meet with him before you go to the counselor? Will you invite him in the car ride with you? I believe that God is a provider. And it's okay to seek help receiving your provision. But will you spend some time with your provider? Will you allow him to do a work first? See, God uses all sorts of natural means to interfere in our lives and to help us. And it's so easy to forget that he is our source of provision, that he's our source of life. It's so easy only to go to him when we need him, when our traditions have run their course and they are no longer helping us, when our coping mechanisms break us down. Now, if you're struggling with addiction, seek some help, but also remember that it is Jesus that breaks the chains of bondage. That it's Jesus that's doing the work. And you know what? When he doesn't answer you, when he doesn't give you what you need or what you think you need, when he makes you wait for your deliverance, he's still worth it. I was thinking about this morning in his prayer meeting and as we were praying through some of these ideas. And I was reminded of when I used to get up, when I had the capacity to get up early in the morning. And I'd sit on my couch and I'd read my Bible. And sometimes my daughter would wake up and she'd come out and she'd sit with me. There were a few times I tried to read to her what I was reading. Leviticus knocked her right out. Most of the time she would just fall asleep. But there she was, just cuddled up to me, asleep. Because as her daddy, I was worth just being with, even though I wasn't really doing anything for her other than just being there. And you know, your father Your Father wants to have you with him. It doesn't matter what you've done. Look, I'm not saying live your life however you want to. As a follower of Jesus, I invite you to follow him as he has asked us to. But a lot of us we're tired. We're beat up. We've been trying to make it on our own, trying to tough things out for so long. And it's exhausting, isn't it? In Isaiah chapter 55, I believe, I didn't write down the reference apparently, but anyways, the call to God is this: come all who are thirsty, come to the waters, and you who have no money, come buy and eat. Come buy wine and milk without money and without cost. Why spend money on what is not bread and your labor on what does not satisfy? Listen to me and eat what is good, and you will delight in the richest of fare. It's amazing to me. We come to God with absolutely nothing. There's nothing that we can give to him. As far as he's concerned, we are completely empty. But it's when we reach that state that we find that God has so much more than we ever expected. When we stop trying to put him into tradition, when we stop trying to put him into systems, when we seek God for God, that's when we really discover who he is.